Thank you very much, Alex, for that generous and hilarious introduction. I'm very privileged. I count it an honor to be here to speak to you on the topic of stewardship of creation and Ubuntu ethics of creation, collective ownership, and responsibility. I count it a privilege to stand on these holy grounds that have witnessed a lot of milestones, going back especially to 1910, when you had the World Missionary Congress here in Edinburgh. And so many people whose paths have inspired me, like Andrew Walls, Lamin Sané. So I also count it privileged to be the first Catholic to give this prestigious lecture. I don't count myself distinguished. I see my life as an imperfect offering and life as constant encounters with love. Now, my presentation is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I invite you to my continent, Africa, and a consideration of the Christian mission. Among scholars and practitioners, there is a strong case being made that the center of gravity of world Christianity is shifting to Africa. However, beyond the center-periphery framework of interpreting contemporary Christianity, I wish to propose 3 areas of central concern for our wounded and breaking world. First, climate change. Second, global health. Third, the fact that there are millions, if not billions, of people around the world who are suffering from poverty. And indeed, all humanity, I think, in a post-COVID-19 world has perhaps discovered our human precarity and vulnerability and our own poverty. These concerns, I will argue, should become the central focus of Christian mission in the coming years in a post-COVID-19 world. In the second part, I will employ the African concept of Ubuntu to propose a Christological model of collective ownership and responsibility. I will argue that when we stand at the foot of the cross, what we see is the realization of the Ubuntu ethics of how the talent of one person becomes the treasures of all persons and the entire community and cosmos. And you will hear this line constantly in this lecture. The talent of one person should become the treasures of all persons and the entire community and the cosmos. In the third part, I will develop some ethical principles and practices for understanding human responsibility for this earth, our common home, and ownership of the collective goods of all. Using the 2 parables that I employ from the Gospel of Luke, the parable of the rich fool and the parable of talent, I will develop a cruciform Ubuntu ethics of community. I will propose this Christological interpretation of the African Ubuntu as an ethics, a wisdom, and a spirituality for understanding communal ownership, responsibility, and the ethics of solidarity. I use a biblical theology of these parables to develop some concrete performative proposals on how to implement the ethical propositions that I make. My hope in this paper is to invite you, my dear friends, to the foot of the cross. I will propose a biblical theology of the cross as an exemplar demonstration of what happens when the gift of one person's life and talent become the treasure of all peoples and the entire cosmos. The cross is thus projected as a continuing judgment on a world that is unredeemed from greed and selfishness, and the idols of the self, community, race, nation, religion, and ideologies of power. These sad realities emerge because of the unethical choices of individuals, societies, nations, international organizations, and religious groups that give rise to unjust structures and unhealthy human engagement with one another and with nature. So true are the words of Thomas Berry that you can't have healthy people in a sick planet. So, how have we made this earth so sick? Now, this takes us to a very central concern for me in my own work and in my ministry as a priest. And that point is that it seems that the world is becoming so fragmented, so divided. It seems that there's so much unhappiness in the world today, so much anger. We see wars around us, see the pains and tragedies of human existence today, people drowning in the Atlantic, so many people feeling marginalized, so many people feeling dispensable and disposable. And it seems also that Christianity is not realizing the capacity within its tradition of finding common grounds. A few years ago, Jean and John Komaroff wrote Theory from the South, where they write of the Manichaean dualism that hold Euro-American world in a schismatic binaries, polarization, divisions. And so being invited to give these lectures as the first Catholic is also a statement of intent, is also a powerful demonstration that we need to build bridges and pull down the walls of separation that we find all over us. And it's very difficult, not only in my own tradition, with Pope Francis inviting us Catholics, and indeed the rest of the Christian world, to this synodal process of conversation, of dialogue. Let's talk about the issues that concern all of us. And it's proving very hard, revealing all the fault lines in modern Catholicism. Divisions over contestations over identity. What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a human being? And all that. So I think that what I propose here is that we need to create a depolarizing space for encounter. Can we worship around the same altar? Can we gather in a space? Can we look each other in the eyes? Can we see something beautiful about this life? Or shall we continue in this warfare over the right versus the left, black versus white, rich versus poor, and the future of humanity is imperiled because we can't come even to common grounds on most of the fundamental issues of our times. Even climate change is contested. Hence the need, I think, that the challenge for Christianity into the future is to build bridges within itself as a demonstration model of what we are capable of doing in the world. Now, I like to begin from Africa because there is a regnant theory out there that the center of Christianity is shifting. And I want to contest that, but I don't have the time fully today to do that. But the question that concerns me as an African scholar of world Christianity is one posed by Jacob Olupona. The fact that the Christian population is growing in number in Africa, while poverty and corruption is growing with it in Africa. The fact that people claim that Africa is the center of Christianity, but sadly, Africa is the center of poverty in the world. Violence, war. Ever since I was born, after the Civil War in my country, in 1970, what I have seen are wars, violence, indeed the architecture of violence. And so the question is, what does it mean to say that Christianity is growing in number in Africa? Perhaps a lot of emphasis has been placed on the social and cultural history of Christianity and less on theological and missionary or missional interpretation of Christianity. Given the fact that the churches of Africa, especially the mainline churches, are heavily dependent on Western donors and mission funds, what does this reality mean for the claim of the shifting center of gravity? Most of the Pentecostal, evangelical, and African-initiated churches appear to be less dependent on foreign money for their work. However, the jury is still out on how these churches sustain themselves. This is why greater attention should be paid to the practice and message of churches in Africa, given that some of these messages involve the exploitation of the poor through different religious justification for tithes and transactional exchanges that are legitimated through some troubling claims on prayer, prophecy, prosperity, and healing. This concern on dependent churches in Africa should be placed in a historical context because close to 50 years ago, African churches unilaterally declared an end to foreign aid and mission money in Africa. Between 1971 and 1974, there was a strong movement for a self-governing, self-reliant, and self-reproducing African church. This movement led to the 1974 All-African Conference of Churches Lusaka Declaration of a moratorium on missionaries and money being sent to Africa. The Catholic Church is not a member of the All-African Conference of Churches, but the documents submitted by the African bishops, Catholic bishops that is, on co-responsibility at the 1974 Synod spoke in part of the need to put an end to this dependency. Let me state, however, that dependency and subordination are important matters, and they have additional baggage in my own tradition, the Catholic Church. Perhaps it is worth mentioning at this preliminary stage that charity and solidarity among churches have always been a central character of Christianity. The Acts of the Apostles gives us a particular example of the dire consequences suffered by those Christians who fail to share their resources with their brothers and sisters in need. Thus, there is always a critical judgment to be made in evaluating the reluctance of those actors with resources who use the desire to avoid cultivating dependency as an excuse to deprive people of the resources they need by refusing to be charitable. Thus, we must admit that dependency rhetoric means something very different when it is used by the rich and powerful of this world than when it is used by subordinated and poor groups. However, the concern here is the unhealthy aspect of this dependent relationship between many African mainline churches and their Western partners because, one, some Western Christian donors use foreign grants as a form of control for what goes on in Africa through the conditions they impose for receiving grant as well as their granting priorities and focus. Two, many of these grants have not worked because of the way they are structured as needs-based rather than asset-based solidarity. Three, the corruption that these grants create. In many instances, church leaders who seek these grants are not accountable to their own people once they satisfy the donors. In many cases, poor priority setting lead to grants that are often obtained to maintain unsustainable structures and institutions, as well as sometimes feeding the lifestyle of church leaders and the elites that are unhelpful to the emergence of self-sustaining and flourishing churches and communities in Africa through the agency of their Christian faith. Second, the center-periphery narrative, I think, is a continuation of the imperial mindset of Christendom, born of the center-periphery global flow of missionaries and aid from the West to Africa. The narrative of center and peripheries of Christianity is an invented map. And I must make a distinction between world Christianity as a process that has its own life and academic reflection on world Christianity. I do think that these two sometimes are at cross purposes, because if you go to my village and say to any Christian there in Nigeria, Africa is the center of world Christianity, they don't get what you're talking about. They are more concerned by quotidian factors. How do I get food? How do I get access to water? How do I send my kids to school? So I think that also Africa does not have any homogeneous map of the universe. So which Africa are we talking about in terms of these centers and these peripheries? Sometimes I think these narratives are quite elitist, often told without attention to the hopes, cries, and anxieties of the poor from the existential peripheries of Africa. Those who drive this narrative are mainly people like me, Western-based scholars, and some local African church leaders. In most instances, they ignore the most pressing challenges facing African peoples and their own failings in valorizing the potential capacity of the Christian gospel to reinvent the future of Africa from ground up. At a more fundamental level of conceptualization, we admit that the experience of Christianity in Africa is diverse. Hence, the need to overcome the unhelpful paradigm of world Christianity that lumps everything together in Africa. There are parts of Africa where the faith is dying in terms of number, even in particular countries. There are many parts of Africa where religious persecution is rife. The growth in number or the positive effects of the Christian faith in Africa ebbs and wanes in some parts and grows in other parts. Thus, concentrating on the complex and ambiguous process of Christian expansion in Africa rather than the current claims, sometimes triumphant, of the shift of world Christianity to Africa seems to me a valid and very urgent approach to embracing the diverse challenges and opportunities for conversion, conversation, community mobilization, and advocacy to address some of the challenges facing African peoples today. Some of these challenges are, for instance, the asymmetrical power relationship between Africa and the rest of the world, issues of racism, issues of abuse of the rights of women, issues of intolerance, and many others. My proposal is, to conclude this first part of my presentation, that the center of Christianity has always transcended space, geography, or place. Even though the missionary mandate had a territorial frame, the missionary work was not to be implemented with imperial scheme and secular stratagem that characterized some of the missionary advance beyond the West, that was mediated through the projects, ideals, and goals of a defunct Christendom. 3 sites that I invite you to think of, and a special gratitude to this center here for the study of world Christianity, for focusing on issues of climate change and ecological ethics this year. In a post-COVID-19 world, we must concentrate first on the sites inhabited by the poor. And when I talk about the poor, all of us, humanity today, in our vulnerability and precarity. Second, the sites inhabited by the sick. And that is all of us in our exposure to COVID-19 and our fragile and bleeding earth, that is our sick planet, which affects all of us in the existential threats that we face because of climate change. I will give the African churches a failing grade when it comes to their involvement in creating an eco-consciousness, ecological justice, helping Africa to mitigate and adapt to the devastating effects of climate change, of preaching a green gospel and addressing issues of pollution, waste disposal, tree planting, and the pain and suffering of many poor people in the continent. And this is also a criticism I level against myself. How I wish African churches gave some time to healing the earth as much as they give to exorcism, healing sessions, and prosperity preaching. The Christian mission must encounter, embody, embrace these three sides because we are all involved and implicated by these three sides. The extent to which the good news is proclaimed and performed at these sites will determine the relevance of the Christian mission for the earth and its inhabitants today and into the future. How we can meet the challenge we face with ecological issues, one of the three sites I mentioned, will occupy me in the rest of this paper. Now let us look at Ubuntu. Pope Francis, in his encyclical On the Earth as Our Common Home, Laudato Si, published in 2015, invites all of us to embrace integral ecology when he stated that everything is related and that we cannot understand the causes of ecological crisis today without taking a total picture of reality. The key category in Laudato Si is relationality. However, the idea of integral ecology is not new. It might be new in the language of the Christian churches and in Western societies, but it is not new in the African world. Now, what do we mean by Ubuntu? Ubuntu is an ethics of community that underlies those values and virtues which promote and preserve the common good through respecting, reverencing, promoting, and celebrating the interrelatedness of all things, humans and the entire cosmos, and harmonious relationship between God, humans, the dead, the not yet born, and the cosmos. Ubuntu is an ethics of interrelationship. It can also be interpreted as a communitarian philosophy. Ubuntu emphasizes that moral acts are to be judged by their life-giving potential as a communal and cosmic life force. Teddy Sakupapa's work on the different understandings of Ubuntu across different African countries bring out important dimensions of this notion, because when we talk about Ubuntu, you have various variants of it in many African ethnic groups. So Sakupapa mentions some of them, including Umuntu, used by the Chewa people of Zambia, Ubuntu among the Ganda of Uganda, Obunu among the Jita of Tanzania, and Unhu among the Shona of Zimbabwe. They all speak of this sense of relationship, a signifier of a quality of being human. So when someone has Ubuntu, it signifies that person's way of being human, our humanness, our capacity to be truly and authentically human. It is also a notion of relational cosmology, a form of social ethics. That is, being with. How do I live with other people? It's also, in a sense, a communitarian philosophy of how you can participate in the bond of life. This is well captured in John Mbidi's articulation of this notion when he translated the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He says, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. This has been a very popular way of articulating Ubuntu. Now, I also think that Ubuntu is a worldview, a wisdom tradition, an outlook on life that emphasizes that we are in this together. It is also a spirituality, a source of inspiration on how to live well. Because the only way to live well is to live beyond yourself, to participate and allow others to participate in what you have. That is the only way of living well. And I try in this lecture to show that when we look at Jesus Christ, what he did on the cross, we can use that as a way of capturing the essence of how Ubuntu looks like. So Ubuntu is an ideal, because the question some people will ask, where was Ubuntu in the Rwandan genocide? Where is Ubuntu in what is going on in Sudan, in Congo, in Ethiopia, in northern Nigeria? Where is Ubuntu when Africa is being ravaged by big men in this internal colonialism or illiberal democracy that seems to be spreading, where you have leaders who are focused on extractive relationship with the state and destroying the economies, embezzling so much money. So some people will ask, where is Ubuntu? So it is an ideal, just like Christianity says, love your neighbor as yourself. Isn't that what we preach as Christians? Do we love ourselves? Do we care? So it's an ideal that can be lived, but can never be fully realized. It offers the kind of theological principles and concrete ethical choices that we all can begin to reimagine the future, that it is possible to create a world where there is solidarity, where everyone is participating in everyone's life, and where everyone is committed to promoting and preserving this bond of life for sustainable human and cosmic wholeness. So Ubuntu is projected here as an ideal of other-centered, life-centered, and God-centered ethics of collective responsibility for one and all. And that is the condition, the only condition for human and cosmic flourishing is when there is this shift in our ethical outlook to begin to be other-centered, life-centered, and God-centered. So I think this kind of ideal is a cosmic liturgy that we can all celebrate. The practice of Ubuntu generates a vital bond of peace and harmony in creation and ritualization of life-affirming choices at both individual and communal levels so that the whole of life will blossom in a healthy and wholesome manner for all creatures. Such harmony and peace emerge when there is a just and respectful order, maintained through the recognition of the beauty of everyone, the beauty of all creation. It is sustained by a conscious and deliberate effort on the part of human beings to heal the earth of exploitation, evil, injustice, racism, poverty, violence, and suffering, all of which diminish life and bring a cycle of death and decay. It also specifies how humans should use the gift of their lives, their talents, their treasures, and wealth for the collective good, and offers us an ethical framework for judging what happens in the world in terms of this intrinsic relationality of all things in a bond of participation. As Pope Francis highlights in many places in Laudato Si', the earth is our planetary homeland. Humanity shares an interconnected homeland with all creation. In many traditional African societies, every member of the created world is regarded as having life. Here, life is not understood simply as sensitive, vegetative, or intellectual existence. What is life? Life is seen as a force of love, a dynamic energy that brings things together, that generates life, a causative spiritual dynamic which inhabits creation in general and is translated and transmitted through every reality in such a way that when I'm sick, you are sick. When you suffer, I feel the suffering. Whatever diminishes you diminishes me. When people are unhappy, there is an imbalance in the multiple chains of relationship in the community that makes it then impossible for any of us to be happy. Ubuntu offers me a category for developing an African ecological ethics. And this African ecological ethics is something that I think we can understand better when we look at it at the foot of the cross. Because as many of you know, many people also say that part of the crisis we have, the ecological crisis we have, grew out of a certain interpretation of stewardship of creation in Genesis. Dominate, rule the earth. So human beings found themselves being the center. We actually think we are the center, but we are not. And in order to reverse that outlook, we need a new interpretation of creation. And that is what I try to do in the following section of this paper. And the questions about chaos in the world, the fall, sin, predestination, these are all complicated concepts that if people feel that the only time things will get better is, in heaven, keep on suffering. When you die, God will reconcile everything. We need to begin to find new ways of retrieving the Christian tradition and reinterpreting it in a way that it can become accessible and meaningful to our times. Because young people, I don't know about you, the young students I teach in America, I only hear, I used to be a Catholic, I used to be a Protestant, I used to be this. That's what I hear today. Were you baptized in the Catholic Church? Sure. You were baptized in the Episcopal? Yes, I even received confirmation. But I am now an atheist. We must pay attention to the future. If the faith is lost to this generation, it's lost forever. And I don't think that the Christian churches are paying attention to the next generation and how to address their needs and concerns, because we are concentrated on still fueling some of these unhelpful binaries that have held Christianity still bound or still born. There is, I think, an eruption of a new energy that can emerge when we begin to see some of the new testing grounds of new ideas and new values that we can take from other parts of the world outside the West. That's not to say that the West is moribund. I do not subscribe to the idea that we are in the era of a non-Christian West or a non-Western Christianity. I don't subscribe to that. What are we doing here if we are in a non-Western Christian world? I don't subscribe to that at all. I think it is very unhelpful. And thank goodness that the center here actually changed its name a few years ago from Christianity in the non-Western world. We need to look at convergences. We need to find greater community rather than celebration of triumph here or decline there. This is very unhelpful. So let me be clear that when we look at traditional African society, what I'm preaching here is not about socialism or communism or something like that, Ubuntu, collective ownership. Some people came here to say, okay, let's see what it talks about. I am not a Marxist, but I think that there are some ideas from Marxism that can be helpful to any of us here. Traditional African society supported free enterprise and individual claims to the fruits of their labor. Traditional African society was an agrarian society where everyone was encouraged to apply themselves to work, to provide for themselves and their community. But there is one proviso. The individual does not work or eat alone. The individual, he or she, works with and eats with the other. The individual does not suffer alone, does not die alone. He or she suffers with and dies with the rest. In one of the earliest writings in 1789, the African ex-slave, Olaudah Equiano, wrote that popular, interesting narrative. And he makes this claim about how traditional African society built up strong economies through agriculture and supported people through solidarity from the rich to the poor and the strong to the weak. Or louder writes, and I quote, "Everyone contributes something to the common stock." That is Ubuntu. And as we are unacquainted with idleness, we do not have beggars and thieves. Why? Why didn't they have beggars and thieves? Some people say he might be exaggerating here. What do you mean there are no thieves in that society? What he was saying is simple. If the land belongs to everyone, you're not going to be stealing what belongs to you. And if everyone is attentive to the needs of everyone, then you don't have to be a beggar in order to be helped, because your neighbors anticipate your need even before you open your mouth to ask for help. The benefit, and he continues, the benefits of such mode of living, or louder continues, are obvious. Our agriculture is exercised in a large plain where land is held in common. Some hours walk from dwellings. All the neighbors gather together as one family. They use no beasts of husbandry. They only use their instrument, hoes, axes, shovels, and beaks, and pointed iron to dig with. The point here is clear that this was a community-based way of living, solidarity. What this African is writing about is, as he tries to claim his own agency, reclaim his freedom, is that in traditional African society, life is a continuing story in which everyone's story belongs. Everyone contributes to the common good. However, I say, in this continuing story that is creation, our human choices define individual and collective stories in culture, systems, institutions, and corporate affairs, and all are intertwined in shaping collective destiny of all humans and creatures. Thus, the choice of each of us, for instance, those who have the means, must be inserted into the larger and continuing story of the world to see clearly how the choice is good or bad, relative to how it enriches or impoverishes the human and cosmic story. Now, the African interpretation of history is eminently rooted in human agency and freedom. History is not just movement of an ineluctable forces of nature. It is not karma. It's not like a vicious cycle. History, in this African account, is not simply a movement to an ultimate point from a time of fall and chaos because of the sin of Adam and Eve to a final fulfillment that will come at the last judgment. Rather, history is a dynamic web of life stretching into God's infinite horizons and God's boundless, recreating, sanctifying, healing, and saving love, in which all creations, past, present, and future, are intimately tied in this cosmic story that is always in the making. This web of life is redemptive, not because of a prior condition of chaos, curse, fall, or decay, but because of the presence from source of the creative, saving, and energizing love of God that has always been here, lived as an unmerited gift by our human ancestors and our cosmic ancestors, for whom Christ, as proto-ancestor, is the exemplar par excellence. So what we have here is not a cycle of decay. What we have is a cycle of love and participation in the cycle of life of the earth, in a bond of relationship. It is not a cycle of punishment, of suffering, of retribution, waiting until the last day when God, the Master, lists before you all your sins and banishes you into hell, into that lake of fire. It is rather the fire of divine love that is always cleansing us, purifying us, and moving our hearts to love in a selfless manner. In this kind of reading of creation, there is no cyclical movement of sin, punishment, redemption. What is important in this account or revision is a new consciousness of our common responsibility for this earth and everything in it, as well as our reverence for the work that God does in creation and beyond creation. It is a recognition of our humanity, of our human agency in realizing the fruitfulness of the earth, and also our own abuse of human freedom in what we have made of this beautiful earth. We need only to embrace this work of God with reverence, with awe, conscious of our own human finitude, precarity, vulnerability, and temporality vis-a-vis God's infinite horizon beyond space and time. In this kind of evolving cosmic history, where do we find Jesus? First, let me say that individual responsibility in this kind of account of creation is also collective responsibility writ large, because we are all implicated in the fruits and gifts of creation. The choice each and every one of us makes can destroy the earth. We think of the wars going on now. Last week or 2 weeks ago, I hear Russia said, we've moved some nuclear weapons to Belarus. Think of what a single decision of any human being can make to destroy so many lives. Think of millions of people who have been killed by war or by our lack of attention, care for those who are dying, those who are drowning. And so here we see that Ubuntu does not deny individual autonomy. Rather, it specifies the end proper to individual exercise of freedom. This is because Ubuntu affirms that the choices of individuals are ethical to the extent to which they bring about abundant life for the whole community, not just for the individual. Ethical choices are those that strengthen this bond of life, opening wider the possibility of participation in the common good for everyone, so that all creation can flourish and share in the good things of life. The practice of this ethic of Ubuntu orients human actions to solidarity, community, collaboration, and cooperation in strengthening the web of life and creating better possibilities for the realization of the common good for all. Having this kind of humanity is a choice which people make from the perspective of a communal and global consciousness, rather than out of fear of divine punishment or ending up in hellfire at the end of your earthly life. So let me attempt to read the cross and invite you to the foot of the cross through this Ubuntu worldview, ethics, wisdom, and spirituality. How can we read the suffering and death of the Son of God as Ubuntu? I can only provide you here some thoughts in my own continuing search for an African grammar of ascent, an African grammar of action and self-surrender as I stand at the foot of the cross. When I survey the wondrous cross as an African, and I gaze upon the poor man of Galilee, I see the expression of the communal Ubuntu in its highest manifestation and purest form. The most significant title in Africa for Christ is the African Ancestor of Humanity. Why? Because he is a perfect exemplar of the ethics of Ubuntu. His death, as interpreted by Christians, enhanced the possibility for human and cosmic flourishing. His lifeblood is a vital circuit in the value chain enacted in history by all those who live beyond themselves, and thus fructify the earth by ethical choices that strengthen our human and cosmic participation in the life of one another. At the foot of the cross, I see the beauty of a life, or rather, a love. That is, the divine human life so totally poured out that nothing remains unused, nothing remains unrealized, but all is given. As the Lord said on the cross, it is finished. This, for me, is more than the traditional kenosis. Yes, the Lord poured himself out for others. However, read through the lens of the ethics of Ubuntu. The life of the Lord Jesus that was given for all on the cross does not belong to him. It is a life that he received from the creator of the universe through the gift of his natural family in Bethlehem, within this family root of David and his human ancestors located in multiple communities that goes back to the infinite past. It is a life that is fully united with that of God, the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the Trinity, and all creation by his incarnation. So, the life of Christ was fully united to earth and fully united to heaven, united to all men and all women and all creation and the entire cosmos. And that is also true of each member of this cosmic family. The Ubuntu ethics, as we stated, is captured this way: I am related, therefore we are. Thus, the life of Christ is what was received through multiple chains of relationship, healthy, life-giving, other-centered relationship between the Son of God and his ancestors going to the infinite beginning of time. And what remains on the cross is what was given. Nothing was lost in that life because it was given away in self-sacrifice. So all that is given is all that was received. So in dying on the cross, the Son of God received the fulfillment, or rather the fullness of life, and offers to all the possibility of living in the same self-sacrificing way and experiencing the same effects through self-donation in a self-sacrificial manner. And that's why the Lord says, if you wish to save your life, you will do what? You will lose it. If you wish to gain your life, you must give it away. Or like St. Francis of Assisi wrote, is in giving that we receive. This, I think, captures the essence of Ubuntu. So, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve violated the spirit of Ubuntu and lost the harmony in creation. An African eco-theology metaphorizes the curse imposed on our first parents and the punishment of the flood as a way of capturing the chaos brought to the human and cosmic harmony when we refuse to live for and with others. In its orientation to relationality, African ontology always moves away from this dualism of curse and blessing, heaven and earth, or heaven and hell, divine and human. On the contrary, the Garden of Eden is a loss of what ought to be there. That is, a world characterized by justice, beauty, peace, proper stewardship, collective ownership, and abundant life. On Calvary, the Lord reverses this order, this movement towards selfishness, pride of self. The Lord reverses it through this expression of Ubuntu. The Son of God replicates, renews, and recreates humanity through this new cosmic emergence. His cross models the way to realize this treasure of the divine human life, which can bring to birth in creation a new life and a new ethical model for giving totally all that one has received. Through this total giving by his cross, he models for us how to bring creation into a new space for the fecundity which comes from participation in the gift of another. When we listen to our stories and allow ourselves to be touched by other people's stories, and when we ourselves share our own stories with others, we find that all our stories help us to understand our connection and that we all are facing similar situations and circumstances in this life. In the story of everyone, in the stories of the cries of the earth and the cries of the poor, I can hear my own story and my own human nakedness. I can touch my own wounded flesh in the wounded faces, wrinkled faces, suffering humanity. It is only by paying attention to how our human and cosmic stories are connected, how they converge, that we can see how our stories can be redeemed by God's self-sacrificing love and our courageous and sacrificial love for everyone. In this way, we also see how the unconditional manifestation of love on the cross through the pain, suffering, and death of the poor man of Galilee becomes a unique example of this Ubuntu spirit when the life and treasure of one person becomes the treasure of all persons. Calvary shows us what can happen when the closed narrative of humanly designed unjust structures and institutions are exhausted. When a good steward of our collective patrimony breaks this cycle of decay, of selfishness, of pride, of greed, of anger, and all the things that make us all sad today. Calvary shows how the sacrifice and commitment to our common good in a common home, even to the point of death, becomes a boundary between good and evil, and the limit beyond which evil cannot go. It is what happens when the treasure of one life, the life of the Son of God, becomes the treasures of all lives. Or to put it in the words of Pope Francis, this is what it takes for one person to restore hope to a broken and wounded world. It is this wisdom of the cross, the highest expression of Ubuntu in my reading, that I propose as the foundation for Christian ecological ethics and mission in developing the roadmap for collective stewardship, collective ownership, and our own collective responsibility through a new Christian ethical reimagination of a new creation. Now, Ubuntu can be related to the foolishness of the cross, because what I'm saying is similar to the foolishness of the cross. Is it possible for us to live this way? Is it possible for us in this world that we find ourselves in our different silos or in our different prisons, countries, nations, religious groups, is it possible for us to live this way? It looks foolish. But so also was the cross, foolishness to people. I think that we can see, for instance, in the two parables that I wish to use to conclude my conversation with you, the parable of the talent and the parable of the rich fool, we can see, for instance, in the parable of the rich fool, an example of a man whose treasure became a curse unto both himself and others because he thought only of himself and acted only for himself. What happens on the cross is an exegesis of the contradiction and chaos in our world today and in our global history, and the interruption of false historical movement through an exemplary choice, on the other hand. The principle being proposed here is true, that by its very nature, the self-sacrificing love of the Son of God shows how the treasures of one life can become the treasures of the whole community. My proposal is that the ethical choice of responsible stewardship must begin from a worldview that is Christophomic in its nature. And this worldview that I call Ubuntu is clearly exemplified for us when we look at the cross. So we need to find a new kind of wisdom, a wisdom that can help us to address the challenges that we face today. Because the wisdom that we have embodied to this point is not helping us, is no longer working. I think that Ubuntu has the character of this wisdom that St. Augustine, for instance, proposes about understanding the intention of things, the things that are made. Why is this earth made? I think that the old ecological thinking is that the earth is made for us, human beings, and we can use the earth as we deem fit. But the wisdom that we are realizing when we look at different ways of looking at creation, the myths of origin in other traditions is that we human beings, we came very late to this place. So we are actually very vulnerable. We are very fragile. If you look at the cycle of human beings, some animals, when they are born, they can survive. But human beings are so fragile. We must recognize our own human fragility and then move away from the idols of power, the idols of the economy, and the idols of nation, and the idols of human domination of this earth. And that takes me to the final part of my conversation, looking at these two parables and then developing some ethical proposals that we can reflect on. I am looking at the parable of the talent and the parable of the rich fool. And I have chosen the account from the Gospel of Luke, because in the Gospel of Luke we also find some other parables that are specific to Luke, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that offers us another way of looking at what the parable of the rich fool did not do. What the rich fool did not do, the Good Samaritan did. And we look at the parable of Zacchaeus, how he used his talent. So these two parables form the concluding part of my lecture. First, the parable of the talent is set in all three synoptic gospels as the last parable before the passion of the Lord. It is also set within the eschatological discourse of Jesus in light of his passion. In Mark, for instance, it is presented as a eulogion. Be on your guard, stay awake, because you never know when the time will come. It is like a man traveling abroad. He has gone from home and left his servants in charge, each with his own task. And he has told the doorkeeper to stay awake. So we already see here human responsibility. So the question is about responsible stewardship. So the question for us must be cast within the context of the ultimate purpose of the moral demand vis-a-vis human finality. Why this earth? Why are we here? We must answer that question, because understanding why the earth, the purpose of the earth, can help us to establish the proper scale of value, the ultimate purpose of all temporal goods, and the truth of our human finality. Just as in the parable of the rich fool, the last words of Jesus in that parable is, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." Thus, we pose the questions: what are the fruits of the eschatological fulfillment that everyone can bring about through the exercise of authentic human freedom in the use of these talents, conscious of our human responsibility and the uncertainty of the end? How can the exercise of human freedom in the use of our talents, our gifts, be for each person an authentic witness to Christian discipleship with an eye on the ultimate purpose of the moral demand? Second point, in both Matthew and Luke, the account has a similar structure with significant variances. In Matthew, the master is presented as a wealthy man, probably an absentee landlord, who gives talent to 3 of his slaves. Matthew adds the addition that is quite significant, that the master gave to the servants each according to his abilities. The complexity of the social context where there are masters and slaves invites us even to a deeper interpretation of the parable as a critique of the exploitation of the poor and forms of eugetism between the wealthy landowners and the dispossessed, dependent, and exploited poor. One is challenged to probe further into the Lucan development of this parable in search of another parable that helps us to unmask the hidden oppressive structure in this parable. I use these parables just to show what human responsibility look like and how we can then use it as a way of reimagining a new ecological consciousness that is rooted on a different understanding of human responsibility that is Christoformic. What reveals itself in the text when put in the context of the development of the narrative offers one a clear-eyed prophetic critique of some forms of wealth creation, exploitation of the earth, systems of money-making and retention. In Luke, we hear that this landlord is of noble birth and has gone to take possession of a kingdom as a king, and he gave minas or pounds to 7 servants. In both Matthew and Luke, the third servant condemns the master as evil, exacting, and someone to be feared, and buried his talent. In Matthew, he hid it on the ground. In Luke, the servant wrapped it up in a handkerchief. Here, we are confronted with the decisiveness of human freedom in determining not only the fate of individuals, but also the fate of others and our collective destiny. What we use or abuse, who we treat well or maltreat, are all implicated in the movement of history in a kind of chain reaction that affects every one of us. Third, there is an element that we can only find in the Gospel of Luke, the aspect of delegation, which was sent to stop this nobleman from becoming a king, which is not found in Matthew. 2 passages in the text in verse 14 indicate that the people hated this man who was to become king. That when the king took over the throne upon receiving the royal mandate, he ordered all his enemies to be killed. This parable is the only parable of the Lord that refers to actual historical events. In the case, the parable refers to Archelaus, who ruled Judea for 10 years. According to Josephus, Archelaus traveled to Rome upon the death of his father, Herod the Great, hoping to be crowned king of Judea. But Archelaus was just as bad, if not worse, than his father. So a Jewish embassy traveled to Rome, petitioned the emperor not to make him king. Even though he was granted a reduced sphere of authority than his father by Caesar, Archelaus was such a ruthless and brutal ruler that he was eventually removed by Rome, who replaced him with Roman prefect Copernicus, who later was replaced by Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of the province of Judea at the time of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. The violent end to the parable may sound so brutal and quite unlike the gentle Savior, but it is a hyperbolic image emphasizing the ontological shift for all creation that Jesus' own passion, death, and resurrection entail. Whatever the case, lurking behind the text is the aspect of responsibility, receiving and giving, accepting and impeding, rewarding and punishment. Ultimately, the individuals mentioned in these 2 interlocking parables all had some responsibilities and assumed different positions. But the question is, how their choices enhanced the collective good or hampered it. In drawing out some of the implications of these 2 parables, I make the following concluding comments. It is important to note that Luke is the only gospel that uses the word business to describe the task given to the servants. Well done, good and faithful servants. At the beginning, the master says, do business with this until I come back. Pragmateuma, do business with this. Be busy, pragmateusaste, be busy, get busy. Now, I like to use this as a framework for the first principle that I propose, that the Lord has sent each and every one of us here to do some business here. Everyone here has a responsibility, unique to you and specific to you based on talents, skills, and gifts that God has given you. It's not simply the theological exercise of the intellect, our advocacy, the books we write. It's also the life we lead. One of us, a single individual, can turn the arc of history for us. And so the first point here is the trust that the Master reposed on us, that God reposed on human beings. Do business, get busy, help me, to make this world a beautiful place. So we must read this parable in a cruciform manner. That is, how did Jesus do business, if you like, with what was given? He made the treasure of his life the treasures of all lives and of all humanity. Now we can find a key to unlocking this do business with this by going back to Luke 8:15, the parable of the sower. As for the part in the rich soil, this is people with a noble and generous heart, who have heard the word and take it to themselves and yield a harvest through their perseverance. So who is this kind of person? What virtues do such fruitful people embody as contrasted with the wicked servants or with the rich fool? Pope Francis, in his reflection on the parable of the rich fool, says, and I quote, Jesus tells the parable of a rich man, a good entrepreneur, whose field had yielded an abundant harvest, and who was full of riches. And instead of thinking, but I will share this with my workers, with my employees, that they also might have a little more for their families, thought to himself, what shall I do, seeing that I have nowhere to put my crops? So I will pull down my barns and build bigger ones. More and more, the thirst that comes from attachment to things never ends. If you have your heart attached to things, when you have much, you will never be satisfied. This is the idol that humanity is worshiping today. And if you like, unquote, if you like, the ethical choices that we have made that goes back, from the Industrial Revolution, scientific and technological determinism is rooted in this mentality that we have to use up what we have on earth as if it belongs to us. Now, we have a good portrait from the teaching of the Gospel of Luke of how we can use our talents in a very good way through responsible stewardship. Gerd Tyson offers an important distinction between vertical and horizontal solidarity in the way the early church interpreted texts like this. Vertical solidarity is the charity that is given by the rich to the poor, in the hope that God will be merciful to the rich for their magnanimity, forgive their sins, and keep them growing richer and richer and richer so that they will continue helping the poor people. And you see that vertical solidarity. I started out thinking about the relationship between the church in Africa and the church in the West. It's a relationship of dependency. So people, I call it a needs-based approach, not an asset-based approach. So people are constantly wanting to help Africa. Helping Africa has become a big business, isn't it? It's run down, you go to universities to study how to help Africa. And no one ever says, why is it that you've been doing this for as long as human memory can go, and you still continue? Because helping Africa is not measured. And what gets measured gets done. But I don't think Africa needs anybody's help, because Africa, as I have shown in the account of Olaudah Equiano, he described Africa of the late 18th century as so beautiful, so lush, a place of habitation, joy, peace, and tranquility. So here, we must begin to make a shift from vertical solidarity, the one that moves to making people richer so that people are getting poorer and are getting helped, to horizontal solidarity. Horizontal solidarity, it is Ubuntu, is cyclical. Everyone becomes rich. Everyone is sharing. It is the kind that is expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, that we are not creating social clientele for some rich patrons or some rich donors. The actual importance of the rich was structurally compensated by the elements of horizontal solidarity, and morally by the sharp criticism of how people make wealth and how they use it, especially the kind of society that creates slaves and masters, people who are getting poorer and people who are getting richer. And so we have an example of the Good Samaritan and Zacchaeus as a different way of using wealth. So in this parable, the Samaritan, we can find that is only found in the Gospel of Luke, we see the missionary attitude of all people as pilgrims on the way, how we can help each other, help this planet that is wounded and broken by making use, as the account says, of filthy wealth, conscious of the fact that no one can serve both God and mammon. The kingdom comes, as in the case of Zacchaeus. When Zacchaeus takes that bold step, he becomes converted. He repents from exploiting the wealth that God had given him, from manipulating people, from lying, from greed, and all the other negative vices, to thinking about the other. He then assumes the Ubuntu spirit. Notice that in Luke, the story of Zacchaeus is immediately presented before the parable of the talents. And the parable of the talents is followed by the entry into Jerusalem. It is as if, in this narrative plot, the Lord is inviting those who will follow him to the new Jerusalem, to the new creation, to become people who are like the Good Samaritan, people who are like Zacchaeus, who are no longer exploiting the earth through greed or exploiting people through all kinds of falsehood, but now people who follow the Lord to live in such a way that the treasure of their life becomes the treasures of all lives. Let me conclude with few principles that I want us to think about. It will be part of a conversation at the end of this. To put it in other words, what is at stake here for me when we talk about human responsibility and stewardship today is greed, selfishness, and pride of self, individual as well as national, racial, religious, you name it. Indeed, I would say that when my grandfather wanted to become a Christian, he refused because, he had 4 wives. And so when they said, you have to come and wed with one, he said, I don't think you people are just. What did the other 3 wives do to me? And they didn't stop at that. They always said also, you have to bring all the idols you're worshiping, the ancestral place where he connected with his ancestors. Then he said, now I know you guys are not serious. Our ancestors were condemned that they are worshiping idols. But today, I think, we have to deal with new idols entering our churches. These idols are idols of denomination. I'm Catholic, you are Anglican, I am a priest, you are a laity, I'm a man, you're a woman. So we have these idols, and now Jesus is being displaced in our churches. The gospel is not being proclaimed because we are proclaiming power, money. In my homeland, Nigeria, going to church these days makes it very difficult because you will stay in the church, 4 collections, 5th collection, 10th collection. And I've traveled around in my responsibility now as the North American coordinator of a papal mission doing theology from the existential peripheries. And I travel around Mexico, Canada, and the US. What I see, churches being closed. The population is not going down in Chicago or in Toronto or in New York or in St. Louis. Why are they closing churches? Because people are not coming back after COVID. And why are people not coming back? They fill stadiums or stadia to watch soccer. Is it that God is no longer appealing to them? So our answer to evangelization today is efficiency, not missionary conversion or missionary outreach. Because we are filled with idols of the self, idols of power. And then we have now become a church that is looking inward, not outward. We need a church that goes out, a church that reaches to the peripheries, a church whose message is not about the power of the church, but the power of the gospel. You know, someone said to me, one of my students, I said, go and study the Bible. I think it helped me to go and study the Bible. And he said, yeah, I like to study the Bible, so I would defend the church. I said, you don't need to defend the church. Defend the gospel, and God will defend the church. So the idols that have filled the church today, the idols, we must work hard at moving away from idol worship in the church so that we can worship the true God. And we must move away from the idol of neoliberal capitalism. Because, as Pope Francis says, it has produced economies that kill dead bodies, sick universe, sick earth, and sick people. I know that it would not please Alexander Duff if I cited Nietzsche here in this, but I do like to mention Nietzsche here because I agree with him totally that greed, hatred, and envy are three partners which work together to destroy creation. We can see how these are working together in ravaging our lives, despoiling communal bonds at local and international level, fueling destructive flames of neoliberal capitalism, materialism, protectionism, wars, and violence, and creating the environment and ecological field that is making all of us sick. So we need to embrace, number one, the idea of talent and ownership seen through reciprocity, or what Gary Stansell calls gift exchange, that is present in the gospel tradition and in the early church. So Ubuntu, the spirit that I have described, the wisdom I have described, is present in the early community. The early community, they held all things in common. They said there was no one among them who lacked anything because they provided for everyone. Actually, in one of my books, I write about how the Roman emperor was so furious with his minister in charge of taking care of the poor because he said, these Christians with little means take care of their own. Why can't the empire take care of its own? So we must embody this principle of reciprocity rather than the transactional exchange that we have with creation, that we have with one another. So it is not just about equalization and parity of both parties, but rather it is about a covenant relationship. Ubuntu is an invitation to this covenant relationship with creation and with one another. The second point is that the Look-Ask community that I mentioned emphasize the sense of community. This is because in Look-Ask we find many examples of sharing, participation, compassion. It is a missionary gospel that invites us to go out with a universal claim. So there is a contrasting image of the wicked servant who failed to produce good fruit and the good servant who produced good fruits. In both cases, there is the aspect of the trust which the master has on all the servants to invest some portion of his good to them, just as God has trusted us to take care of this earth. But one was afraid and did nothing with it. Another was diligent and became a good steward with the money. The good news to the poor can only be realized through a community where everyone shares in everyone's joys and sorrows, and where everyone's asset is recognized and supported to flourish. What made the servant not to invest the master's talent already points, in my own thinking, to how exploitation voids agency and stewardship, how manipulation and unjust structures create mistrust and learned helplessness on the part of victims of history, like this servant who felt that his master was very wicked. This dynamism of reversal in the gospel is about how to change the structures of injustice that make some people, like the wicked servant, so weak that they are incapable of being protagonists in their own history. So it is not simply a restoration of the good of order, but human responsibility, collective responsibility means strengthening the agency of everyone and creating opportunities so that people can exercise their freedom in a way that the treasure of their life becomes the treasure of all lives. At the foot of the cross, we see the missionary principle of how God operates in history and how divine philanthropy in the death of the Son of God offers a strong principle for the life of the world and a model of daily witnessing of all the followers on the way. In this light, each one of us have received so much from God. But the use of the gift and the support needed might begin with identifying in our communities, in our faculties, the barriers to performance. And Ubuntu ethics proposes that the barriers to performance are those vices or factors that weaken or sever the bond of love in communities. In many instances, the structural nature of social oppression and injustice make it impossible for people to actually perform authentic stewardship. Finally, Ubuntu is a very poetic notion that invites us into a different space of life in abundance that God provides. This abundant life is possible for all God's creatures. We have enough in this world for everyone. We can realize this fullness of life for all of God's people and creatures in our times amidst the pain and anguish of today in the face of climate change that is creating many dry lands and deserts. We all are wounded by the violence, wars, shocking poverty, and human suffering around us, and the tension among and within nations, creating rivers of blood and rivers of tears for so many of God's people who are suffering helplessly in many painful sights in our world today. In the face of all these tragedies around us that are sadly the result of the abuse of our human freedom, the prophetic message that I give to you is that God is coming to do a new thing among us. There is the possibility of a new heaven and a new earth in this world. Let us not lose hope in the possibility of human solidarity and collective human stewardship. How can this happen? It is a task I leave for all of us here. We have to reimagine a better possible world. It is not simply something to wish about. It is a dream that we can begin to live. We are challenged to turn again to nature, to one another, in a spirit of reverence, care, recognition, and solidarity. I believe that it is in turning toward one another and to creation in all its wonder, richness, and variety that we can find again the face of God and our way to our common future in a peaceful and healthy world. Let us commit ourselves that each and every one of us can live in a way that the treasures of your life will become the treasures of all lives, and the treasures of the earth, our common home, can become the common patrimony in which we all share in the spirit of Ubuntu. May we all behold the credibility of this message as we look at the life of the poor man of Galilee hanging on the cross today before us, in the lives of millions of God's people who are suffering today, and of our wounded and bleeding earth. What we see on the cross as we behold the wondrous cross is the face of our collective future if we make that commitment to live beyond ourselves. Thank you very much.